started. Photography in the time of COVID, that's my program today. And COVID has brought immense suffering in all walks of life, but there are silver linings, and one of them is it allowed me to discover the acres of diamonds I have right here in Michigan. And that's what I'm going to share with you today, the places that I've gone during the COVID time to find pictures of birds in Michigan. And I am basically a bird photographer. I'm a birder too, but I don't bird the way birders bird. If I hear there's a varied thrush appearing somewhere in Allegan County, I don't necessarily drop everything I have and go find it, unless somebody says it's really approachable and shootable, in which case I'll go find it. But before COVID became a real deal, we got to run out to California, our last trip out of state. My son lives in Monterey, California, which is just south of San Francisco a ways. And near the Asilomar Marine Reserve, where we stayed in a small cabin and walked along this lake shore, this part of the ocean shore every day, and saw some remarkable landscapes. It's a great place to photograph landscapes. They do it right in California, a lot of places. They have public access that runs all along the beach, and then the houses are back a little ways from the beach. So there's large areas, large swaths of public access. So landscape photography is something that I do as well as birds, but not as often as birds. And so playing with the light in those rocks is really beautiful. This is an example of what I call ghost waves. The idea here is you set your camera on a tripod and you set your timer for your shutter for about 20 seconds or so, and just let the waves roll in and out of the scene. You have to use a polarizer or a neutral density filter, or you have to shoot late in the evening so that you don't have a lot of ambient light to get this really ghosty effect on the waves. And that's kind of a fun way to shoot. There are a few birds that we saw in January during our brief visit, including the western gull. They love to ride along the crests of the waves. Here's an immature western gull that's caught a Pacific purple sea urchin. I'm not sure that he knows exactly what he's going to do with that because it's festooned with all these little spikes, but leave it to gulls to figure out a way to get a meal out of anything. Brown pelicans would also surf along the crests of the waves. And along the rocks, you'd find birds like the black turnstone pecking away at abundant food sources in the rocks. The surf bird and the black oyster catcher were also abundant out there for those. That was kind of nice to be able to photograph some birds while we were out there. But unfortunately, COVID became a deal about the time we were coming home, and we didn't leave the state of Michigan again for the rest of the year, and have not. Canceled 2 trips to Europe in order to avoid contamination. We had both of our shots now, so we're pretty well off and anxious to get started again. Well, one of the spots that I rediscovered, I hadn't been there for years, but I rediscovered the Kensington Metro Park area, which is a 4,500 acre recreational and wildlife area located just on I-96 from beyond Brighton, between Brighton and Detroit. And it's a great spot. We go there for the deer because the deer are sort of acclimated to people. They're not pets or by any means, or they're not totally approachable. They have about a 50% less fear than they would out in the wild. So that gets an opportunity to shoot some interesting shots. One of the reasons I went out there was to find this Leucistic deer, white-tailed deer. It's not an albino because it doesn't have pink eyes, but it's leucistic, and she has given birth to some normal fawns. She's sort of interesting to go find. I've never seen one of those in the wild. The reason you go there is because the birds are so easy to approach. But if you feel a little foolish with thousands of dollars worth of camera gear and you can't even take a picture of the bird because they're too close. And these birds are somehow acclimated to people. If you walk down the trail in Kensington in the woods in the wintertime when the birds are actively looking for food, you'll be followed by a little flock of birds. And all you have to do is hold out your hand with some seed in it, and the birds will come to your hand and eat right out of your hand. And so that's kind of a nice opportunity for bird photographers, because we're used to struggling to find birds that we can even approach. And that's one of the keys of bird photography, is to approach the birds. But here they're approachable. So you can get interesting shots and lots of them. Head shots like of this common grackle that I took just last week down in Kensington, or the tufted titmouse. Here on some oriental bittersweet, which is not the bittersweet we like to see. There's a domestic variety. This is an invasive species, but it's sort of like purple loosestrife, you know, it's pretty to look at, but horrible to live with. So, but you still find all the winter birds down there are very approachable. And because they think you have food, they'll hang out in the trees around you and give you plenty of opportunities. And that's one of the keys of bird photography, is to find places where you can get close to birds. If you watch bluebirds, for instance, bluebirds will often do a little hover flight just before they land, and that's an opportunity to get these flight shots. Most birds, they dive right into the perch, but a bluebird will sometimes do this little hover stutter step, and that's an opportunity to get a flight shot just before they land wherever they're going to be. So what I look for when I shoot bird photographs is a combination of things that some people overlook, but you'll learn as a bird photographer, you have to pay attention to this. One is the perch. The perch has to be interesting, it has to have some texture, and it has to be in proportion to the size of the bird. You can't have a giant log with a tiny bird or a huge bird on a slim reed. So that's one thing. The second thing is you need to have the light coming from the right direction, usually over your shoulder if possible, so that you get a catch light in the bird's eye, like in this bluebird. You want the head to be somewhere between 90 degrees to your left or 90 degrees to your right, but pointed towards you, and at least to a certain extent. You want to have the bird doing something if possible, eating, singing, vocalizing, roughing, going through roughing up their feathers or raising their crest. And then the most important thing for bird photography is a good background. That doesn't mean every background has to be completely blank like this, but the background should not detract from the picture. So, and the final thing is that I try to photograph birds whenever possible at their eye level. Just like when you go into the professional photographer to have your portrait taken, they put the camera, generally speaking, at your eye level. There are always exceptions to this, but as a general rule, that's the way I try to photograph birds, and that takes a fair amount of patience. There's no better way to spend an hour standing out in the field than with a camera waiting to get a bird picture that you're proud of when you're done. Here's the red-bellied woodpecker at Kensington, the downy woodpecker, and they have a really nice turkey population there, and they are quite approachable because they're not hunted. The deer in recent years have been culled, so they're a little bit more suspicious, but the turkeys are fairly approachable, particularly if you've got some peanuts or something to throw them. And the culture there is to feel free to feed the birds. They're not so particularly handsome close up, but they're interesting. We'll put it that way. And so you can catch these behavior shots and flight shots and things like that that are very difficult otherwise around here where the birds are hunted. There's also a red-tailed hawk, which I'd say, again, is about 50% less afraid of people. Well, if I'm at the wastewater treatment area and I see a red-tailed hawk on top of a telephone pole and I stop my car, just slowing down the car will often cause the bird to flush. This red-tailed hawk is a little more approachable. It just caught a chipmunk and we were able to photograph it on the top of an old snag, which was a nice opportunity. But getting there early in the morning is a problem. If sunrise is at 7:30 and it's a 3-hour trip to get there from Grand Haven, that means I'm up at 3:30 and out the door at 4:30. And that can get old in a hurry, but it's worth it if you get there at sunrise, because that's when the good light is, that's when the bird has the action. There's a number of sandhill cranes out there. This one's doing the famous sandhill crane lean, just about ready to take off. Anybody who's watched those birds can recognize that behavior. This was just last week. The birds are really getting territorial now and fighting with each other and doing this antiphonal singing in pairs. So that's kind of fun to listen to. I look at things other than birds occasionally. I get distracted by a little miniature landscape or a grand landscape, but basically it's birds for the most part. So after Kensington, I returned home, and that's my woods in the back of my house in the wintertime. And that's when the feeder photographs start. So setting up a blind usually by a feeder, either at my house or a friend's house, and we photograph through the little aperture in the blind and wait for the birds and freeze our butt off, but it's worth it. So our favorite day to photograph is where you have snow coming down and soft overcast light, not a direct sunlight. So these are common feeder birds that I'm finding at my feeder or my friend's feeder. And they're common birds, but it's fun to try to portray them interestingly. This spring, we had a Carolina wren appearing at my friend's feeder, and there was a territorial dispute going on here with the downy woodpecker. I would put my money on the wren anytime. Downy woodpeckers are scrappy, but those wrens, they are really scrappy. We try to work on themes during the year, and one of the themes I try to look at is where you have a sexually dimorphic bird coloration, feather coloration, to try to get both the male and the female in the same shot. And that's a goal of mine, and I'll show you another goal of mine that I've been working on lately too. So this is a male and female house finch. It's the American goldfinch. You remember that in September, they do a complete molt, flight feathers, contour feathers, the whole 9 yards. And this is their winter plumage, their basic plumage. And then when they get into their breeding plumage, they molt only their contour feathers, not their flight feathers. So you see these nice wide white margins on there yet? Those will be just narrow strips by the time August comes along, because the white feathers, which lack melanin, are really soft and easy to wear down. But that's the molting strategy of that bird. Red-bellied woodpeckers are coming to the feeder. Hairy woodpeckers. You know, that's always difficult. You think it's going to be difficult to tell the difference between a hairy and a downy woodpecker, but then when you actually see one, you go, oh yeah, I get it. So that's a pretty good sized bill. And the pileated woodpeckers are also coming to the feeder, as well as the little guys like the white-breasted nuthatch, which are abundant in the wintertime around here, and the cardinal, again, as a well-known feeder bird. Later on in the year, I had 2 active wren nests on my property. My house is located on about a half an acre, and there's woods around it. And I put up 2 wren houses, and they were about 50 yards apart, and both of them had action. So that was cool. They both raised a clutch or 2, as well as I had 2 clutches of bluebirds in my yard. So that was kind of fun. That's sort of a lazy man's bird photography, just to roll out of bed in the morning and take your camera and tripod and go outside in the front yard and shoot, but gives you some nice opportunities. My wife Barb planted some cardinal flowers in our garden. The hummingbirds love those cardinal flowers, the male and the female ruby-throated hummingbird. I'm so glad I live in Michigan, where there's only really one predictable species of hummingbird, so I don't have to sort these things out, all these females from all these different species. So it's just nice if you see a hummingbird, you know what it is. And this is my karma shot. This was taken not far from my house. We have a real problem with chipmunks. They were undermining our sidewalk and our paving stones, so we had to get rid of some. So rather than use a death trap, I used a live trap, and I caught one, and I drove it about a mile from my house and dropped it off, and I had my camera in the front seat. And because I spared his life and let him go out in the woods somewhere, I like to think that karma rewarded me by having these deer just stand perfectly still and rattle off about 12 shots of them. So this is right near your house, Pam Cater. The next spot I spent a lot of time at is Kellogg Bird Sanctuary down in Hickory Corners, Michigan. It's a great spot for waterfowl, and particularly if you can get some variety like the wood duck. We had a nice opportunity with the wood duck. And this is the other goal that I had this year, was getting flight takeoff shots of ducks. The problem with these puddle ducks is that they can burst out of the water and just with no notice in a fraction of a second, because they have these big long wings. So they don't have to have a running start like the sea ducks, the ocean ducks, or the so these things are really hard to get, and you have to be quick on the draw. But what happened in this spot at Kellogg Bird Sanctuary is that they were always swimming in this pond, this open area, which was opened by a bubbler. And when they approached the ice, they all kind of took off from the same spot. So I just watched when he got to that spot and tried to get him. And it was a lot of fun to work on. The mallards are somewhat easier because they have a tell before they're going to take off. Most of these birds, unless they're alarmed, have no tell, but a mallard will duck his head up and down just like they do before they're about to mate. And then that's a sign that they're gonna leave. And so you just kind of concentrate on them until you get them. I like the backlit shots you can get there of the Canada goose, and the Canada geese are always up to some sort of nonsense, making a lot of noise and flying around. There's some unusual things that show up once in a while. This is a leucistic female mallard. It's not obviously a hybrid. It's because it's pretty much the same size as a regular mallard. And its colorations are otherwise the same. It's just that it lacks the melanin that a normal mallard would have. So that was kind of fun to find. There's a leucistic swan out there. It's a trumpeter swan. You know, they have black feet, and these have yellow feet. So that's partially leucistic. You get swans that play in the tannin water and get all stained. They're kind of fun to see, and they're always engaged in some sort of cleaning ritual. This time of year, there's a lot of flight activity and a lot of pairing activity and territorial activity. This was interesting to me. It looked like there was a flight director directing the traffic as it landed here. These are, again, trumpeter swans. Beautiful birds. They're the largest bird in America by weight, and that's they are impressive. They take about 30 yards for a takeoff. They have to have that much clearance on the water or on the ice or snow to get airborne. And when they land with a great splash. Winter is a great time to go out there because they're white birds, and in the sunlight, you often find that you get really harsh shadows, but because the snow acts as a reflector, it bounces light back into the bird and under the wings. So you can get some really nicely lit shots. This is behavior from just last week out at Kellogg, and these are obviously paired off birds here, and they're just sort of going through some sort of greeting ritual, or in this case, not a greeting ritual, a driving off a potential suitor ritual. What's really fun is you can get them backlit, where the sun is coming directly into your camera, and that's when you see all the spray that's kicked up and just the trace outlines along the edge of the wing. So that's nice to see too. This, I really can't tell if these guys were in love or these guys were angry with each other. So there is quite a fine distinction between love and hate among these swans. And it's difficult sometimes to tell whether they're being territorial, whether they're liking each other. Again, with the backlighting, you can get the vocalization and the fog coming from their mouth, which is kind of fun. So after you get all those kind of pictures, you start looking for things that are a little more artistic. This is a reflection of a swan in fall color. This is a swan floating again with the fall reflection of leaves. Well, the misty mornings are nice just for the moody shots with the fog. This is, I think, Beth, your microphone is not muted, maybe. Anyway, yeah, so after a while, after you get all the regular shots, you start looking for something a little more unusual, even including them in a landscape or two. So that's probably why they're my favorite photographs. I remember I told you about my mission to photograph the sexually dimorphic birds, and here's an example of the mallard, male and female, coming for a landing. And this was a COVID landing here by this female mallard. She took a hard fall on the ice, but I just wrote it off to the COVID. Everything was going wrong anyway. So mallard taking off again, and here's a little pied-billed grebe playing around in the snowy water. There are some other birds around there, but they run the gauntlet of shotguns. So they stay way on the other side of Wintergreen Lake, which is a lake where the Kellogg Bird Sanctuary is located. So you can get the ringneck ducks. The buffleheads, these things come close only when they're chasing a female. And I was there last week. There was one beleaguered female being chased by 7 male buffleheads, and she would land, they'd besiege her, she'd take off. And usually these birds stay a long ways away from us. But she decided she would try coming over by us to see whether or not she got any refuge. But no, these guys were so lovesick, they just followed her right in, which was to my benefit because I got the shot. But other than that, they're always hard to photograph. Hoffman Preserve. Boy, it was fun to rediscover that again. I used to go there when my kids were little, but Hoffman Preserve is a great spot. 7 minutes from my house for red-winged blackbirds in the early winter, and the females even in the late winter, and early spring. Little birds like the brown creeper, and this guy, I'll tell you, this is my first shot of this one is the first time that I've successfully photographed the yellow crown, golden crowned kinglet, because they are so active. There's so much on the move. And you remember the elements of a photograph, that a bird photograph, it has to have a decent perch of the right size, decent light, catch lights, mouth open, decent background, eye level. So it all came together for this guy. But I'll tell you, I worked really hard to get it because they are always on the move and they're really, really hard to photograph. They're usually deep in some tangle somewhere. This little guy was very disapproving of me. This is a ruby crown kinglet. At least he appeared to be, although he wasn't showing his full crest. So he was not obviously attracted to me in any way, put it that way. But fun to photograph. And they too are always on the wings, always on the move and fluffing up their wings and making lots of motion. Other early birds in the Hoff Park include the yellow-rumped warbler. They come through right after with the kinglets, and then the northern flicker I also had an opportunity with there this past spring. There is one belted kingfisher, but it stays quite away, so it's a long shot to get him. It's hard to fill the frame. I have to figure out what his routine is again if he's back there this year. Wood ducks are fairly common in the marshy waters, and there's my sexually dimorphic birds taking off together. So there's a double hit right there. There's two goals in one, the male and female mallard bursting out of the water. These little guys, again, are the purple loosestrife of birds. They only have one cygnet, which probably means that some snapping turtle ate well that spring, but they were just kind of, they're beautiful in a way, but nasty in a way too. So it's hard to say. The soil was fairly abundant there. Pileated woodpeckers are pretty predictable in Hoffma. And of course, the muskrats are always building mounds and plying the waters. Upper Macatawa Natural Area, I had been to a few times before, but never photographed seriously. And this year, I'm going to do a lot more of that. But last year, I got a little taste of some of the things that I could find there, including the sora, which was fairly common out there. Virginia rail. I missed the American bitter, and everybody else and their brother got beautiful shots of it, but I couldn't get them to come out in the open. Heard them a lot. Red-winged blackbirds, the swamp sparrow. That's another goal, is to try to get them with their crest up. And usually they do that when they're excited about something and singing. And if you can get a little bit of environment with the picture, it's better even than a fully blurry background. A song sparrow. And this little guy, I had worked hard to get a sedge wren a couple of years ago, but this year was my year of the sedge wren. I seemed like I found them everywhere, which was great. The sedge wren was singing out in Upper Macatawa. And the other thing I've noticed is that there's a lot more great egrets around than there had been in the past. That might be a climate change issue, but this was in Upper Macatawa as well. Then Amon Park, not so much for birds, but for wildflowers. I find the sharp-lobed hepatica there. They always come out a lot sooner in the season than you think. You think, well, I'll go out in the early May and find them. Well, they're long gone in early May. So they're April flowers. And the trouble is it's cool, but they don't want to open up until the sun comes out. And if the sun comes out, it's too sunny, so they're hard to get just right. But if you work it, you can find them. They're beautiful flowers. Of course, the bloodroot grows in some profusion out there in the park as well. And these wood frogs, at the same time that the red maples drop their blossoms, these wood frogs are mating. And they are, again, lovesick. And that's when you want to photograph things when they're lovesick, because they're not paying attention to anything else, and they'll float really close to you and give you all kinds of behavior shots. So that's kind of fun to go to. Muskegon County wastewater management area is another favorite spot of mine for COVID photographing. And it's close enough to my house that I can get there at sunrise without a lot of discomfort, which is nice, particularly with the new 231. I can just shoot off out Lincoln Street up to 231, and I'm there in less than a half an hour. The draw this year was these red foxes. There were 2 dens of red foxes. I'm not sure how many kits there were in each, but it seemed like there were probably 6 or 7 total between the 2. And the setup here is that you can photograph from the dike, and then there's a ditch filled with water, and up the bank on the other side is where they built their den. So they're separated from people. They're pretty oblivious to people. And you can watch them all day long and have all kinds of behavior shots. It's just, you got to have the patience to wait for them to come out of their den and do something. And you got to have a pretty long lens. This is shot with a 600 millimeter lens on a crop body, which makes it 900 millimeters effective. That's like looking at it through an 18-power pair of binoculars. So it's they're a little ways away, but you can still get some decent shots. And here's one calling one of the gulls or playing around with the gull wing. There are plenty of gulls around, including the ringbill, which are still nesting on attempting to nest on the center dike, and always hovering above whenever you're anywhere near. The breeding plumage on these birds is beautiful because they have this nice red ring around their eye and red in the gape here. The feathers are also pristine. It's a great time to photograph them in May and early June. There's also herring gulls out there, which again are in breeding plumage. And once in a while, I find something like a Bonaparte's gull this spring. There are other gulls out there. I just haven't been lucky enough to photograph them. Other birds that I could photograph this spring out there were the bufflehead, the eared grebe, the horned grebe, the ruddy duck, both the male and the female, or the female and the male, and the northern shoveler. And then I got my twofer with the northern shoveler with the male and the female in the same shot. Oftentimes that takes 2 quick shots because you don't have enough depth of field to get the eye sharp on the male and the female. So what I'll do is I'll take 2 quick shots, one focused on the female, and then quickly change my focus to the male, and then just substitute the eyes, the head of the female, so that it's sharp. Or the male, as the case may be, to get them both sharp. Sometimes you can get them both on the same plane, but otherwise it's pretty difficult. Canada geese are abundant out there, and they raise their young. They're fun to look at, just little guys hauled up along the shore and following mom's instructions. But nice subject to photograph in the early spring. And there's always a bald eagle around of some sort. I'd say this is about a 4th-year bird, would be my guess, based on the coloration. Next year, you should have an all-white head. The Allegan State Game Area is where I go in the early summer, late spring, because the field birds are located out there. And the early morning landscapes are just sort of really iconic for West Michigan meadows and fields, farm fields. And so that's kind of a fun reason to go out there. If there's no birds around, you can still photograph some landscape pictures. This is all shot early this summer. Usually June and July are the best times to go out there for me. But this is one of my nemesis species. It has been for a long time, the eastern meadowlark. I just haven't been able to get close to them. And last year, I promised myself that I would really work hard to get an eastern meadowlark picture. And so I got a little bit closer. Still not quite as the shot that I want, but I got fairly close, and pretty good representative shot of the eastern meadowlark and all of its habitats, and also the western meadowlark, which is hard to tell visually from the eastern meadowlark, but you can certainly tell from the calls. So that was kind of fun to be out there. Other field birds include the kingbird, the eastern kingbird. And these guys are remarkably skittish too. They'll, you know, you see them a lot, but to get close to them is really not easy. They just kind of like to keep their distance. So you have to take your time and be persistent. The orchard oriole is singing out there. They have a beautiful call. The song sparrow, another beautiful call. And these guys are pretty approachable for the most part. The willow flycatcher is found out there. And of course, the indigo bunting. There's a lot of habitat for indigo buntings. It's one of the real predictable spots to find bobolinks in those farm fields, and they sort of maintain them for their, to accommodate their breeding, which is nice. So many domestic farm fields, you know, you get a nice field of alfalfa, and just about the time the breeding season starts, the farmers come along and harvest it. But these are maintained to allow these bobolinks, it's the female bobolink, to successfully breed. And this one obviously is working on a nest. If you sit in a, this is what we do, this is what I do. I go out in the field, I take a little folding stool and set it down. Then I sit down on the stool with my camera and my tripod in the weeds, just sort of half concealing myself. And the birds get used to me after a while. And you watch them, and you see how many grubs and worms and caterpillars and bugs and spiders and crane flies they collect. It's just amazing. I think we would be overrun by insects if it wasn't for the harvesting done by these birds. Another bird out there, which is a kind of a specialty of the, oops, sorry. Well, you got it. Maybe I'll go back here. No, I won't go back. It's a dick sisal, and then the field sparrow is, this one is near a nest, obviously, and it's got a nice mouthful of something to feed to a young bird. And this is the Savannah Sparrow. Let's see, previous. There we go. This is a Savannah Sparrow with some crane flies and other insects. I'll probably not be an entomologist in this lifetime, because there are about 10,000 species of insects that occur in the Great Lakes area. Compare that with 10,000 species of birds in the whole world. So there's a lot of frustration sometimes trying to identify these insects that are appearing in my pictures, but I do my best to figure out what they are. But these little caterpillars and so on, I really don't have any idea what they are. They're just good food for these industrious little Savannah sparrows. A plain sparrow of the field is, of course, the grasshopper sparrow, which is vociferous if you have good hearing. And if you don't have good hearing, like if I don't have a hearing aid in, I've lost that high-pitched sound, and all I see is them opening their mouth and you hear nothing. But if you put a hearing aid in, or you have good hearing, it's a very unmistakable hissing kind of high-pitched call. Again, the sedgerins out there and various kinds of habitat doing their thing, doing what sedgerins do. And they are wonderful birds to watch and photograph. There's some spiders out there. I have to probably give this to the spider speaker that spoke here 2 months ago, and try to figure out what that one is. The white-tailed deer are fairly abundant out there. This female held her ground for a long time and then just took off running. So we walked to where she was holding her ground, and there on the ground was a little fawn. So we got a picture and got out of there in a hurry. During the summertime, the wildflowers in the field include the purple coneflower, the purple prairie clover, the hoary vervain, black-eyed Susan here being invaded or providing a resting place for a katydid. You can tell it's really early in the morning. There's still dew on the katydid and on the flower. So this is just after sunrise in June or July, probably July. Now I think about early July. And that's a great time to be out there in those fields, particularly when things are calm. And sometimes you look at something like a Deptford pink, which is really a small flower, but the real fun is to get really close and see what's living on the Deptford pink, like this little jumping spider. Here's common St. John's wort being pollinated by hoverfly. There's a green bottle fly on some alyssum. It's a housefly visiting a daisy. So they're all pollinators one way or another. There's also some really nice array of butterflies out there and skippers. This is the European skipper, nectar and some milkweed. The northern broken dash flicker, the Aphrodite fritillary, the Edwards hair streak on some butterfly weed. There were a lot of these Edwards hair streaks out there in Allegan State Game Area. So had our way with photographing those things. Then the Carner blue. And when I showed this to a person, they said, well, why do they call it the Carner blue? And then he opened his wings, and then you know why they call it the Carner blue. This is on goat's rue. They like lupin and goat's rue. They like those legume type plants to nectar on and to nest on or lay eggs on. Clouded sulfur is another species out there. Of course, the monarch butterfly and the Joe Pye weed. The Appalachian brown, found that out there this summer. And then we head out to the Holland Harbor Lighthouse, and I didn't spend as much time there this year as I would like to have, but this pier right here, this North Pier, is great for migrating shorebirds when they come through. And so you can, what you do is you just set up on the pier with a tripod and sit on either a stool or one of those devices that you're supposed to moor a big boat to, and just wait for the birds to get close to you. This is semi-palmated plover, a least sandpiper, a Baird sandpiper, and the sanderling. These were all shot this fall. There were a lot of other species there. I just didn't get out there enough for some reason this fall. I got busy or something. But this was just a couple of weeks ago. There were still rafts of these diving ducks out there. I'm not sure if they're still there. I suspect they might be. The common goldeneye, the greater scaup, the lesser scaup, and the redheads. They all sort of flock together in these big groups of ducks, and when one gets excited, they all get excited, and that's when you get some nice action shots like these takeoff shots. I did manage one getaway from home with another photographer who was also taking care to avoid COVID, and that was to the UP, mostly for landscapes up there, not for birds. So early morning landscapes in the UP. This is Fish Lake in Alger County at sunrise, Moccasin Lake in Alger County at sunrise, Red Jack Lake in Alger County at sunrise. Then what we found after the sunrise, we had a few successful sunrises. After that, it got windy and rainy for the rest of the time we were up there. So you can always tell when a photographer's been subjected to wind and rain because they get closer and closer to the ground. So maidenhair fern we photographed, and then it got so bad we were resigned to photographing little vignettes of wintergreen, or worse yet, the side of a tree, paper birch. But once in a while you get a little bit of sunlight that helps. And this Grand Sable Dune shot from the log slide region there of Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore has this swath of birch trees down here which turn yellow in the right time of the year. This is mid-October, early October. That's kind of a nice little visual hors d'oeuvre for this landscape photograph. And then we get so bored, we start playing with what they call ICM, or intentional camera movement. And that's where you go out into a woods and you instead of holding your camera still, which we spend so much time doing, we move our camera during the exposure. So we'll take maybe a 2-second exposure while we're moving our camera and try to get these kinds of abstract visions of the forest. It's kind of fun to play with. And then to wind things up for the year, the Stu Visser Trails. This was really a eye-opener for me on Otto Beach Road here in Holland area. I had been there a couple of times, but never really had a chance to explore or plumb the depths of Stu Visser Trail. But I'll tell you what, that was just a remarkable place for bird photography this spring. This is an area that is got swamp and marsh and wetlands and bird life and all kinds of stuff. And it's so accessible and so approachable, and it's free. And the only problem for most people was that the trails were all flooded. So unless you had Wellingtons on or some sort of boots that came up to your knees, you weren't going to go far on these trails, which was also nice because it kept all those pesky joggers off from there. Not only were they scaring the birds, but they make me feel guilty. So that was good to get rid of them for a while. But anyway, we had a lot of fun photographing out there. And this is the reason that so many of these little warblers come through. Again, if somebody knows what these are, I'd like to know. I call them gnats. They could be midges. I don't know what they are, but they're a favorite. So here's an orange crown warbler that's got one. Here's a yellow rump warbler that's about to get one. Here's a yellow warbler that's about to get one. And here's a black and white warbler not getting midges, but just working his territory up and down the trees. These are all photographed at Stu-Visser Trail this spring. Palm warblers were abundant. Both the male and the female warblers were coming through. Nashville warblers and all their resplendent yellow beauty. Tennessee warblers, subdued, but yet really nicely colored, in my opinion. One of my favorite birds, the black-burnian warbler. Only complaint I have about this is that the perch is a little bit big, but this will have to do for now. That'll be a reason to go back in the spring and get them on a smaller perch, but still a fun bird to track down and see. And getting them down from the treetops is the problem with birds like black-burnians. They often will be really high in the trees. There are some areas where the boardwalk actually goes up into the trees, so you get sort of an eye-level view, and that's how I got the bird, this black-throated green warbler and the Cape May warbler. Both the male and the female were present in there. Common yellowthroat, of course, they're everywhere. American redstart at Stu-Visser, the blackpoll warbler. One of my favorites, the bay-breasted warbler, also fun to find out there as they're coming through. The northern water thrush and the prothonotary. The prothonotary is very predictable out there. You don't always get them with that nice tail spread like that. That was just lucky. That was the benefit of having 9 frames a second. He wasn't somewhere in the middle of 9 frames per second. He flanned his tail. So I wouldn't claim that I saw it coming, but I was lucky enough to get it. So there is an element of luck, we'll put it that way. And these guys were everywhere. They were mating pairs, and they would be down close to the water sometime and up in the bushes other times. But there was a nest just off the boardwalk where you could set up on the boardwalk with your tripod and camera and wait for the birds. And they brought insect after insect after insect to that hungry brood. This is my favorite warbler at all, the bobbing warbler, which is also known as the Snagus monofilamentii. And they were everywhere too. I think that the fishermen also liked the spot. On the ground below, the solitary sandpiper. And once in a while, you get some other songbirds like the cedar waxwing or the swamp warbler or the barn swallow. Or here's the dimorphic pair again. So I was lucky to get those. The downy woodpecker, the male with the red top knot and the female without. Just kind of, he was moving in on her and she was moving away from him. So that was not a really good dynamic. I think their love life was somewhat truncated, if you'll pardon the pun. That's why I insisted all the microphones be muted so I don't hear any groaning. This is, of course, a nest hole for the red-bellied woodpecker. And there was also a hairy woodpecker out there nesting, and this is a young waiting to be fed a grub. The eastern starling was nesting out there. So a lot of these birds were able to photograph in their nesting capacity. The tree swallow was close to the nest here, but not on the nest. There is a tree swallow nest just out of sight. The eastern phoebe successfully raised some young, and there's a young that had flight feathers sufficient to fly, but you can see the contour feathers were still coming in on this little guy. American robin scrounging in the grass for some worms to feed the immature American robin. The mallard with her brood, all staying close to mom. And they run through these waters, and of course there's bass and big fish and turtles in there. And I was photographing, and suddenly I heard this tremendous cacophony of duck sounds just off to the left of me. And I noticed that one duck was struggling in the water and the others were all flying away and scolding very loudly. And she flailed for a long time, but obviously some snapper had her from below, just hung on. And she struggled and struggled and struggled until finally she gave up and went underwater, and that was the last of her. So snappers are out there. There's also a pretty good population of screech owls. There's the red-faced eastern screech owl and the gray-faced screech owl. And that's how I spent my time in COVID. So if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer them if I can.
Yeah, beautiful photos as usual. I think there's some time for some questions.
And if there are none, that's okay too.
Any questions?
Sure, I got one. Can you talk a little bit about your photographic setup?
95% of these pictures were taken on a tripod. So I use a tripod with a gimbal type head made by Wimberley. That's designed to hold a long lens without flopping over like you get with a ball head.
I remember seeing that when you were at Hoffman last year, I guess it was.
Yeah, that could be. And I use a Nikon camera, and I use a crop body camera for most of these pictures, most of the bird pictures, which means that the sensor is smaller and therefore magnifies the effect of the lens. So I use a 150 to 600 millimeter Sigma lens for the most part. And my crop body, that gives me a maximum of 900 millimeters. So like I say, about an 18 power pair of binoculars. And that's it. So it's just a lot of time and patience, really.
So what kind of shutter speed do you usually shoot at?
Well, for birds in flight, I try to be at least 2400th of a second, and preferably 3200th of a second. For birds that are moving fast in the bushes, usually 1600th of a second. For birds that are just sitting still on a branch, 500th of a second. So birds don't usually just sit still on a branch unless you're talking about a screech owl or something like that. They're always moving their heads because there's predators everywhere. And so they're constantly on the move. And so you need to keep your shutter speeds up. And because the only way we can do that nowadays is because we can raise our ISO on our cameras so high that frequently I'm shooting at ISO of 1000 or 1600 or even 3200, which is the only way you can really get a high enough shutter speed to capture that action. But it would be impossible with film. Remember the old Velvia 50 film that you put in your camera? So these will, that was very, very limiting. You'd have to shoot at very low shutter speeds, and it was almost impossible to catch action. But now with birds in flight, if you shoot at a fast enough shutter speed and a high enough ISO, and you can get some great pictures. And there's better software too to eliminate noise from pictures.
Are you using Adobe Photoshop or something else?
I use Adobe Lightroom most of the time.
Lightroom.
And where Lightroom can't handle it, I pass it off to Photoshop. Then I have 3 plugins from Topaz: Topaz Sharpen, Topaz Noise Reduction, and Topaz Gigapixel. And those are specialty softwares that plug into Lightroom or Photoshop to allow you to address specific problems like sharpness or noise, or raising the resolution of a resolution image.
A question on your landscape photos. For that particular lens, the Sigma, was there a neutral density filter that you particularly liked?
There is not for that lens, but I have like an 80 to 400 millimeter Nikon lens, and I use a neutral density filter for those. And I use I have 2 of them. I have a 6X and a 10X neutral density filter. But those are, so if I were to go out with just one neutral density filter, I would use a 10-stop neutral density filter, which eliminates 10 stops of light, which allows you to take these slow motion pictures, or motion pictures, I'll put it that way, in bright light.
And would that be good for like waterfalls and stuff?
Yeah, yep, it would be. It would be good. Although I think that's a bit much for waterfalls. I often will get away with just slowing everything down as much as possible and using a polarizer, which takes away 1.5 to 2 stops of light. So a polarizer will oftentimes take away the amount of light you need. And if you want to take away more light than that, you'd probably be better off with a 4 or 6 stop neutral density filter.
Okay. Ed, I noticed on some of those pictures that you had that you might have used a card, colored, a blank card in back.
No,
case.
No, nothing like that. It's all natural backgrounds. And the key is that you need to get a bird far enough away from the background. That's what a lot of people don't understand. They think, here's this bird and he's down in the bushes and I take a picture and all I see is sticks. Well, I don't take pictures of birds in sticks. I wait till they get out in the open, and that's part of the success there. So if you have a long lens and you shoot at wide apertures, you throw everything in the background out of focus and actually turn it into just as blurry, out of focus, plain black background, but you can't have things close by. It has to be a long ways away. So Hoffman's a great place to do that kind of thing because you've got those bushes right along the trail, and behind that is nothing but marsh. So when a bird lands high in a bush like that, you photograph it and everything in the background gets blurred out. But I don't use any cards or any artificial backgrounds at all. It's all natural.
That bridge at Hoffman is wiped out, right?
It was last year. I don't know if anybody, Carl or Judy, have you been there to see whether or not it's back? Or
I was there.
I was there
today. It's still out, but the township says it's on the schedule to be repaired.
Oh, good.
Okay.
So they were waiting for a grant last fall, and they're hoping. I think it's on the schedule for this summer, but I haven't seen any update on that.
One advantage I have is as a former elected official, I can walk on water. But when I'm with other people, I don't like to show off, So. But yeah, so I'll be anxious for that to get. We still manage fairly well there, but it'll be nicer when it gets finished by far. Hopefully next year.
How does the tripod work on the water? Pretty good.
No problem at all. I have giant flotation devices on it.
One of the trees right before the broken boardwalk fell over since I was there last, and so if you take those wooden slats as a suggestion to not go over to get out to the benches where the thing is broken, you now have to climb over trees to get over there. So there's a further blockade to getting out as far as you can get out.
I knew Mother Nature would get in the act again, and yeah. All right.
Are there any other questions? Go ahead. As I said before, beautiful photos as usual. Really, really great bird photography, I think.
Thanks.
And also some good natural history about the behavior of these birds. So I want to thank everybody for logging in tonight, and we look forward to you logging in for our 20 April program on freshwater and saltwater pelagics. And remember that this has been recorded, and I will post it on our YouTube channel. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Good job, Ed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.